Well, I don't have any videos. I wish I did now, seeing as when I saw those videos. They were quite neat. But I do get to talk about biodiversity hotspots, and what's not to like about hotspots? If we could identify the hotspots where we find lots and lots of biodiversity or neat places for biodiversity and manage those well, effectively, it would create a lot less emphasis on the rest of the landscape, and we could then do other things throughout much of the rest of the landscape. So identifying these hotspots is a neat thing. It's a piece of work that would be quite valuable for managing the ecology, managing ecosystems. ABMI, so the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, is well positioned to help figure out where biodiversity, where species hotspots are. I can tell you up front that we are just starting this work. So everything I present today is tentative. I mean, tentative might be too strong a word. It's where we've started to look, and all of it will change as we do more work in this area. However, there's some neat things that we have been able to look at, and we're starting to use the information to assess these ecologically significant areas. This is a way that I would describe hotspots. It reminds me a lot of the book Animal Farm. There's a rule in there that all animals are created equal, and then the pigs come along and they say, except some animals are more equal than others. Well, hotspots are a bit like that. Every place in Alberta is important. There's no such thing as a part of the environment in Alberta that's not important. But there may well be, or there probably are, some places that are extra special important. And if we can manage those extra special places effectively, we should have good positive ecological effects for our ecological management in Alberta. This managing or identifying hotspots, significant areas, and Alberta's been doing this for a while. And through efforts of the government of Alberta, led by Parks, there's been a very well-defined set of places where folks have said, those are spots that are extra special important. To a large degree, these spots were identified based on places within natural regions, information about soils, and the presence and abundance of rare habitats or rare species or that sort of thing. And using expert knowledge, and many of the folks involved in this process they'd been around for quite a while, decades, some of them many decades. They knew Alberta well. They were quite capable at identifying where in Alberta you would go to find extra specially important places. And some of the places are important for Alberta, provincially important. Some are important nationally, and some are important internationally. So these are places where one would go to find things that are relatively uncommon and important in their own right. Much of this, though, is based, maybe almost all of it was based on what I'll call expert opinion. These are smart people, but they're still using their ideas. If we can use information that we presently have or have gained in the last few years or even the last decade, we should be able to refine these areas a fair bit. Don't throw it out. I mean, this stuff's good. But can we use the information we've gained in the last few decades to refine these, to make them even better? There is a wide variety of factors that affect whether or not an area is significant, whether or not it's a neat area. Some of them deal with physical features, things like soil, topography, climate. Some of them deal with biotic features, which species are present and how many species and how unique those species communities are. What I'm going to then just explore in a little bit today, and really I'm going to talk, I'm just touching the surface, is using GIS layers, so other layers to help identify where we would go to find ecologically significant areas, hotspots. And then I'm going to end with a little bit of analysis that we've just started on how one would add to existing special management areas. I'm stressing again, this is very preliminary. And I don't mind saying that if in the process of doing some work in the next few years we want to change our mind, I'm willing to change my mind. We started down this path, but we definitely haven't finished yet. So one of the things that can be and should be incorporated into identifying hotspots are just the physical features: rainfall, temperature, growing conditions. These are fairly simple maps. They're actually not that simple at all, but they are maps that one can create based on a variety of different information that we have. And if you overlay and mix them, it's easy to see. You can think, I could find areas that were, from a climate perspective, ecologically different, unique. And in those unique areas, one would expect then unique ecological conditions. That works for climate. It especially works for topography. Things like elevation, as you move from high elevation to low elevation, but you've got aspect and degree of slope on the landscape. Topography is a big deal. And topography can be viewed at a very coarse scale like this. But we've also then done some work that ABMI was sponsoring, but this work was done is being done mostly out of AITF. But looking at local topography. So that square on your right is roughly 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. The red lines are soil polygons from Agricid. So that's a soil polygon in the red. And the colors inside the red are based on soil drainage, based on DEM, a digital elevation model, but it's using I think it's a 5-meter pixel for DEM. So a very fine resolution pixel. So one can identify topography at a very coarse scale, and one can also identify topography and its expected effect on ecological condition at a fine scale. If one mixes these two types of information, you get a really pretty good guess on where you would go to find ecologically significant areas, ecological hotspots, if you wish. A colleague of mine, I'm not at that slide yet. In addition to soils and climates and topography, vegetation also comes into play. We have maps of Alberta that talk about where to find vegetation. I would say, though, that from an ecologically significant area, one is probably most interested in native vegetation. But we've got maps of that too. And we can take that native vegetation and look at connectivity of that native vegetation. So one can use all of these GIS layers, overlay them on top of each other to come up with where one would go to find the unique physical features, the unique ecological hotspots based on habitat, if you wish. And some work that a colleague of mine, Dr. Scott Nielsen at the U of A did, and this would be, I'd say, probably 2 years ago. He took information on climate, soils, and topography, overlaid or used GIS systems to extract and create a variety of layers in each of those 3 habitat types, each of those 3 layers to create classes, if you wish. He defined it in very simple terms, so he tried, instead of trying to get 30 or 40 classes in each, he put it down to just 6 or 8 classes in each. But if you overlay each of those 3 layers, you can come up with a map of Alberta that describes different habitat types. This results in about 250 classes, and some of those classes are going to be unique. There's no doubt about it. They really are unique classes in Alberta and expected to have unique then characteristics from an ecological perspective. The work that Scott did, it wasn't tied back to ecology, although Scott's a very good ecologist, but it was really all about physical features. Can I use existing information to describe unique features throughout Alberta? And the answer is resoundingly yes. This information, if given to somebody who's been on the landscape, who's been here for 3 decades, they can fast point out where they would go to find some neat stuff, some ecological hotspots. We can also use information on critters, species. ABMI collects lots of information on lots of species. We have information about where each of those species occur throughout Alberta. So red, this is a case for tamarack. It's a tree where it's expected to be quite abundant, is in dark red, through to where it's rare or absent in blue. But we have it for a lot of species: yarrow, ruby-throated kinglet, coyote, yellow warbler, moose. We have it for really hundreds of species. It's possible to use this species-level information to also talk about where one would go to find hotspots. Now, if you wanted hotspots for moose, you just look at the moose map. You'd say, where do we think we're going to find lots of moose? And that would be a hotspot for it. But in all likelihood, as managers or planners, we're interested not just in a single species, but where would one go to find a place that has lots of different species or unique species communities? And we've done a little bit of this, and I'm telling you, we really have just scratched the surface. But we said, where in Alberta would one go to find species-rich areas? And that's simply based on those maps of each of the species. So this is based on mammals, birds, plants, mosses, and mites. Those are the taxonomic groups included here. And these are the species-rich places in Alberta, with red being rich and blue being less species-rich. You'll notice that's at the transition zone between the prairies, parkland, and the forest is a rich area. Between the boreal zone and the Arctic zone is a rich area. But there's also a higher richness in the middle part of the province. I was hoping to have a map of uniqueness, but it's not ready yet. And so I didn't present a map of uniqueness, but again, one could use the species maps to create a map of uniqueness throughout Alberta. And this is a map that I showed this morning on biodiversity naturalness. I mean, I call it intactness, but it's really dark green being areas where we expect a natural biodiversity community, and the red being where the communities are not as natural. This information is the kind of information you would use to talk about biodiversity hotspots. We can then not just depend on habitats, but also let the species help tell us where in the province we'd expect to find these hotspots, and where we might then wish to direct more of our management activities. I'll end with a little bit of analysis that we've been doing, and that's actually being done by Ermias. We asked the question, given our species information, can we then find areas in Alberta that would, if we manage those areas, we are managing a certain proportion of all the species throughout the province. I call this complementarity analysis. And I'm going to give you an example of areas where we would what kind of areas one would use if you wanted to manage 5% or 10% of all the different species. The analysis that I'm presenting is based just on lichens. There's no reason it can't be based on other things, but we haven't done the work yet. We locked in the parks in this analysis, and we forced the selection of areas to be relatively big. We didn't want really tiny areas to be part of the selection. So this is a gap analysis, if you wish, or a complementarity analysis. The dark brown are the existing protected areas. Those are the areas we locked in. And we said, and we know we do special management in those already, so we'll say, what do we have to add to the parks and protected areas to contain 5% of each of the different species that we're able to model. And the red points then on this map are the areas that need to be added, so we get 5% of each of the species. It makes total sense. In the Northeast, we got lots and lots of protected areas. We don't need to add much. In the West, there's not as many protected areas, and one would need to add some areas to have 5% of each species. If you wanted 10% of each species, you need to add more areas. And this just identifies where one would go to be most efficient to add those extra species. It's neat. The piece that I think we have to be careful of is this was done for lichens. It's the same results you'd find for mammals, as it would be the same for birds. We haven't done that yet. But when we do it, it'll give us some idea on the degree to which, how we could go about managing this variety of biota. So conclusions. Everything I said is preliminary. Really, we've just started to scratch the surface on this. We're not there yet. But there's a lot of potential here. There's a lot of potential about finding ecologically significant areas, biodiversity hotspots. And I'll go back to this statement from Animal Farm. There may well be places that are unique, and we need to think about managing extra specially. I would contend that managing habitats, good, it's important. Managing unique habitats are important, but also think about managing biota. We don't have to just concentrate on finding habitat hotspots. And it's the combination between habitat and species that's probably most important. And finally, there is 100, probably 1,000 different ways to do these type of analysis. It doesn't make sense to do it all 1,000 different ways. You need to figure out what the manager, the planner, the regulator wants, what conditions they're trying to create, work with them to create these analyses, these evaluations, so we produce something that will actually get used. Thank you. There.
Great, thank you. Did we have one question over here on the side?
Thanks, Jim. Question, maybe just challenge using the word biodiversity hotspots, and maybe the definition has changed, but the last time that came out of my mouth, there was a different definition. It referred to, places that had, I don't know, more than 1,000 vascular species typically endemic to an area. And so, I mean, you look at the boreal and there's maybe 2 hotspots globally in the boreal that qualify as a hotspot, as a local area of endemism. One's in Saskatchewan, one's in Russia. So that's just a picky little thing maybe. Really, maybe the question would be, in terms of, you mentioned right at the end, sort of focusing on, maybe mapping habitats or mapping and using sort of the mapping of the species. So question is there a little bit of a circular modeling going on in this right now? Because some of your species modeling was based on habitat modeling, I think, as you presented maybe this morning. And so really the question is there a little bit circularity in there? And really we're mapping habitat and then modeling species distributions based on that.
So there is, I'm not going to comment on the definition of hotspots, but I agree that the definition there is not a firm foundation for that, and I used a much broader definition than you used. The modeling that we do for species is somewhat interrelated with habitats, but much of the habitat work, these habitat maps that we create, are not used in our species models. So there is habitat mapping, GIS layers that are way more detailed, way more intense than anything you would find with species. And they will bring in then different information that you'd find on the species level. The species, on the other hand, look at how they interact with the habitats, and it isn't a one-to-one correlation. It's not like you bring in this habitat, you get more of that species. It's all about what kind of habitats are there, what is the surrounding habitat there, and the existing north, south, east, west gradient in the province. It is not a simple one-to-one match. In fact, it's not even close to a simple match. The 2 pieces of information have some overlap, but they're not the same at all. And you will get different definitions of where species-rich areas are than where habitat-rich areas are. And you'll get information from a species-level model that is quite a species-level assessment of habitat uniqueness or species uniqueness than you would from a habitat uniqueness model. So they have some overlap, but they're quite complementary as well.
Hi, Jim. I'm happy to see this type of stuff going forward. I think this is the cool, interesting stuff that we wanted to have to have data to be able to do and answer these types of questions. And I respect your 1,000 ways to do it, but when I think of my, wildlife manager mind and my one of 1,000 ways, the question I want to get at is conservation concern and vulnerability. And so when you look or think of the suite of species, and maybe let's skip the birds, because I think the birds are in a different category because we've put so much effort into them. But when you think of the suite of species that you have and our ability to pull together maps of hotspots of species of conservation concern, for example, how are we doing in the performance of those models? Like, you know what, let me just talk a little bit more. I mean, I think of boreal populations as being dominated by very common species and less so by the rarer species. And so it's pretty easy, it's easier for us to get data on those species and have stronger models. But we're often more interested in that rarer stuff. And so are we there yet? Like, can we start to play with that stuff yet?
So, and that's partly why I said there are thousands of ways to do this. There's thousands of ways to cut the species or cut the habitats in what you want to include, and then many ways to identify what you want to include in what is possible to select if you did a gap analysis. To answer your question on what species to include, it is quite possible to say, I'm not interested. I'm not sure that I would make that choice, but a manager could say, I really don't want to be interested in the 50% of the species that are relatively common and ubiquitous, even though they are native to Alberta, and I only want to worry about the lower 50%. And that's quite possible to do. And within ABMI, I mean, it's amazing how many species we monitor and have good data on that we would call, as a society, we call special concern. They're relatively uncommon, but they're common enough to do really quite reasonable models with. There is also no reason one couldn't bring in other types of information on species at risk. If we said, I just want to do this work for species at risk. Now, I didn't show that, but there is absolutely no reason we can't create GIS layers and use those layers to the best of our ability. I would still go back to one of my original slides. There was people that had a heck of a lot of experience that created maps of areas of special places in Alberta. Let's not throw that out either. That was well done. We need to build on all of these different sources when we're doing this work. And we have really just scratched the surface on this.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Jim.